we believe it. So listen, I want to talk about some of the major conflicts that we're seeing around the world right now that I know you've been working on. Number one, I mean, I think this has been top of the list for everyone at the White House, is the situation in Ukraine. In your conversations with President Trump, what do you hear from him about what's going on with his relationship with Zelensky, President Zelensky? Because it's clear that they've never necessarily been best friends, but it feels like in the last few days in particular, that relationship has soured. What's going on?
Look, I think, I'm so thankful that we have a president who's concentrating on peace. And that's what Donald Trump has just said. Let's stop. Remember that we handed Joe Biden total peace in the Middle East and total peace in Europe. He handed us a war in the Middle East and a war in Europe, and we can never forget that. So I do get a little bit frustrated with reporters when they're trying to say, oh, your decision now isn't perfect. I'm like, yeah, we were put in a hole. We were put in a terrible situation. There are no great solutions right now, so you're going to have to be patient with us that we're trying to dig the Biden people out from this terrible $100 billion hole that they created. That's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think it's fair to say that somehow President Trump has met with President Zelensky 4 or 5 times. The Trump team has met with the Ukrainians and Zelensky another 4 or 5 times. So let's say we're up to 10 times meeting with the Ukrainians. I never once heard from the media an outrage that the Russians weren't invited to those talks. However, the one time that the Trump team reaches out to say, how about we talk to the Russians, there's this hue and cry from the Europeans and everybody to say, why aren't the Ukrainians involved?
Well, I think it's because the Russians are the aggressors in this situation, and that's another question I wanted to ask you. President Trump has blamed Ukraine recently for starting the war. You know better than anyone that it was Russian aggression, actually back in 2014. People forget that this goes over a decade back. But it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. So do you have a sense of why President Trump is making these claims now that Ukraine started the war?
I think what President Trump is saying very clearly is we have to stop this war. He is somebody who's concentrating on saying to both sides, let's talk to both sides and figure out how we stop this. Again, we have terrible choices because of the Biden team. There's not a lot of great choices. And so, yeah, is there frustration that things are not perfect in Ukraine right now? Yeah, but I'm a little bit annoyed that we were handed a file that was war when we handed them a file that was peace. And so I do think that we're frustrated. And it's
why make those false claims about who started the war? Why call Zelensky a dictator? What is happening there?
Look, I think the American people are really frustrated with Zelensky. I think that there's a big frustration that he's not making great choices for peace. And again, when the American people are spending hundreds of billions of dollars, there's a frustration. Let's go back, you said 2014. Let's go back just to the beginning of this war, where Joe Biden messaged for more than 30 days that he knew through intelligence that a war was absolutely coming. The Europeans and the Biden administration all did one thing, which was prepare for more war. They talked about more funding for war. They battened down the hatches. They got hardware in there. No one was talking about peace. I actually think it's pretty immoral if the President of the United States says we're having a war in 30 days and we know for sure, and no one shows up in Moscow and Kiev to try to say, let's do diplomacy, let's stop a war. And now we're $100 billion later, and so there's a frustration.
So you said President Zelensky isn't making the choices for peace. What do you think are those choices that he should make to bring an end to this, that he's not making now?
First of all, hundreds of billions of dollars of American money, again, I'll say that, and a whole bunch is missing. So we immediately say, okay, mismanagement of funds. What we want to see is talks with Putin. I don't think that talking means that you're weak. I actually think talking is a tactic to get to a goal. And so we've seen with President Trump, he can show up with Kim Jong-un, and we need to be able to have these conversations with the Russians. Look, I've done negotiations my whole life. I did Serbia-Kosovo negotiations. And I can tell you that if you're in the middle trying to bring peace, trying to make sure we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars on war and we're saving lives, you need at least a person in the middle who can say, I'm going to talk to these guys, and I'm going to talk to these guys, and I don't care what kind of criticism I get, I got to figure out a way for peace. It's not going to be perfect, Dasha, I will give you that. But again, I go back to the fact of we had it perfect in terms of peace. We were handed a war, and now we're being criticized of, well, how do you dig us out of a war, and you're not doing it fast enough, and you're not doing it fair enough? So we're a little frustrated.
So the social media stuff, I mean, President Trump called Zelensky a dictator. Do you believe he's a dictator?
Well, I think when you reject having elections and you're not moving towards that way, that people get angry about that.
Is Putin a dictator?
Of course.
Putin is a dictator?
Yeah, of course.
So the stuff that we're seeing on social media...
But I want to say one thing that's really important in this conversation. Donald Trump has done something different than Republican foreign policy leaders have done for 25 years.
This is a paradigm shift, what he's doing.
We articulate very clearly under Donald Trump, we don't do regime change. We are going to deal with the countries that are in front of us. And our criteria is not how do we make that country better, how do we make America better, stronger, and more prosperous for the people that live here.
So I was in the East